Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. That's the liturgy of the Orthodox Christians who today are celebrating Resurrection Sunday, or what many people call Easter. You would say, hey, I thought we celebrated Easter 4 weeks ago. And on the Gregorian calendar, which we follow in Canada and the United States, we did celebrate Resurrection Sunday then. But in the Eastern world, and in especially the Orthodox churches of the Eastern world, today is Resurrection Sunday. So it would have been last night at midnight, as I remembered from 1988 in Russia, when the patriarch comes into the cathedral exactly at midnight, Christos Voskres, and the people all answer, Voistinu Voskres. Well, that liturgy is so well known around the world. We even use it in English in our church here in London, Ontario. My wife Diane is Ukrainian, and the little bit of Ukrainian that she remembers speaking, of course, is that liturgy. She can do it just immediately. If you say Christos Voskres to her, she'll give you the Ukrainian response to that. Last year, on Orthodox Easter, as I call it, or the Orthodox Resurrection Sunday, I told you the story of the resurrection of the church in China after the horrible years of the Cultural Revolution. Today, I would like to tell you the story of the resurrection of the church in Vietnam, because it is a wonderful, wonderful story. The early church in Vietnam, on the Protestant side of the Christian spectrum, was begun by missionaries from Canada and the U.S. primarily, under a denomination known as the Christian and Missionary Alliance. Today they are simply known as the Alliance. But the CMA, as their initials were in those days, were the primary group who sent missionaries, and lots of them, to Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, what was known as Southeast Asia continent. And they were very effective. In 1975, the estimate of Christians in the country was 125,000, which is very significant as the results of a missionary effort. The missionaries, though, established a very strong national church. It was called Tin Lan in Vietnamese, and in English, the Evangelical Church of Vietnam, ECVN. And it was very well known throughout the area. I met President Ming, one of the early presidents of that denomination, in the early 1980s. And he was just a very, very wonderful man who was able to represent these people before the communist government. But as you know, communists were never very excited about Christianity. If anything, they were totally opposed to it. And they did everything they could to squash the church that the missionaries had established. They considered that Western cultural interference in their land, and they didn't want anything to do with Christianity. Well, that didn't last very long because the national church was so strong in their evangelistic outreaches. There are just some amazing stories of what Vietnamese Christians did to share the gospel with other people in their country. And it was very, very significant. So much so that by the year 2000, at the end of the century, the 20th century, there were at least 2 million Christians and more in Vietnam. And it's a very exciting story. Many of those were tribal people. Vietnam has, in the mountains of the country, lots of different tribal groups. And they were ones who were very strong in deciding to follow Jesus when they heard the gospel message. The best accounting of what's happened in Vietnam is by a good friend, Reg Reimer, from Abbotsford, British Columbia. And Reg wrote a book. He himself having been a missionary in Vietnam and still to this day speaks fluent Vietnamese. He wrote a book called Vietnam's Christians, A Century of Growth in Adversity. And I highly recommend his book if you are interested at all in that country and what has happened in that country, and how the church that was squashed by the communists suddenly has come to new life, to resurrection life, and just exploded in that land. Being a smaller country, we don't always hear these stories. China being so large, we heard very quickly about the growth of the church in China. Vietnam, in fact, most of us in the West didn't even know where Vietnam was on the map until the war that began in the 1960s. And it tends to be war that helps us with our geography. And ever since that war, that infamous Vietnamese War, we have known where that country is and its significance. I want to tell you two stories of resurrection. One, a lady, and one, a gentleman. And these stories just really, really encourage my heart. The first story is in Reg Reimer's book, and it's a story about Mrs. Diep T. Du. And she was a pastor's wife. Her husband was a pastor with the Tin Lon, the Evangelical Church of Vietnam, working among a tribal group in Vietnam for 22 years. They were local missionaries, national missionaries there, and worked for a long time until the war ended. In 1975, the communists were especially angry at the tribal groups because some of the tribal groups, not all, but some had sided with the Americans during the Vietnamese War. And that did not sit well with this communist government that ended up taking over the whole country in 1975. And they attributed Christianity to America. And they called it the American religion. Well, it has some kind of connection, yes, but Christianity is a Middle Eastern religion. I mean, Jesus was Jewish, and all that began with the Christian faith was from the Middle East, not from America. Just happens that many Americans espouse the faith of Christianity. Well, that was the problem that occurred, and so that's why all the missionaries, especially those who were American, but even the Canadians, were almost pressured to leave the country after the war. And it seemed as though the church was going to dwindle because of all of this leadership that was now missing and gone. And for a few years, things were very quiet. We didn't know much about what was happening and going on. But then things began to change. It was true for Mrs. Diep T. Du. Her husband was captured by the communists right after the war ended in 1975, and he was taken and never seen or heard of again. She never knew what happened to her husband, and she sunk into the depths of the grave. She was just totally depressed and discouraged, and for 6 years, she just struggled to even keep herself together. But in 1981, 6 years after the war ended, she was at the market to get some food, and she ran into some Christians from the tribal group that she and her husband had worked among. When they saw her, they were so excited, and they said to her, Mrs. Diep T. Du, you must come and work with us again. We desperately need some leadership and someone strong to come and help us to reestablish our church group in our tribal area. Well, she called herself only a little woman. She apparently was diminutive and not very tall. She was only a little woman in her own eyes. But to these tribal people among whom she worked, she was a giant. And so, on the basis of that invitation, she went back and began to work with them. And she basically just did whatever was needed to get things off the ground and going again. And she virtually became a bishop. She did everything that a pastor would do. Now, the denomination, the Tin Lan or Evangelical Church of Vietnam, did not ordain women. But that didn't stop this little lady. She would preach, she would marry people, she buried people, she did everything that a pastor would do. In fact, she even went to the government officials on behalf of this group to lobby for them to have a little more freedom than they were given and to let them build a church sanctuary. So she ended up being responsible for building the largest church sanctuary that exists in Vietnam. And that was all of her doing. She was just amazing. And she was just resurrected by this opportunity to serve this group. And it just gave her a reason to live. She worked like this until she was 84 years of age when she finally passed away. And at her funeral, 4,000 people came to pay tribute to this little woman who ended up being a giant because of the resurrected life that came from her finding her place and having an opportunity to minister and to be the hands and feet of Jesus Christ in her area of Vietnam. The gentleman I want to talk about is Pastor Vin, who I met in Thailand, of all places. Let me tell you how that happened. I was at organizational meetings there in the year 2001, right after, a year after the turn of the century and just months before 9/11. And we were doing, planning the field testing for the Standing Strong Through the Storm curriculum that I had just completed. Well, at these meetings, one of our colleagues, who's an Asian brother, who worked in Vietnam, said to me, "There's a man I really want you to meet. He needs prayer and encouragement, and he's lonely, and would you be willing to spend some time with him?" I said, "Sure, we have nothing planned tomorrow evening. Let's do that." So the next evening, he brought me this Vietnamese pastor named Pastor Vin. And Pastor Vin told me his story. He said, I worked in a certain area of Vietnam, not far from the jungle area. And one day, a parishioner knocked on my door of my wife and my home. And standing outside my door were 14 ragged, emaciated, hungry-looking, filthy, dirty refugees, who I soon learned were from North Korea. Now, many times North Koreans try to escape from their country, and they will travel all the way through China, down to the very south, out into the jungle, because they want to get to Cambodia, because Cambodia did not have, at the time at least, an extradition treaty with North Korea. So they could register validly as refugees and be treated as such. This group of 14 got lost in the jungle and ended up in Vietnam instead of Cambodia, the next door neighboring country to the west. And of course, Vietnam has and had and still has an extradition treaty with North Korea that if they ever find anybody from that country, they will send them back home. And if they get sent home, there's one of two results. One is immediate death or life in a prison camp. So Pastor Vin invited this group in. His wife fed them. They had them all get a bath. They went to the other parishioners of his church group and gathered clothing so they could have fresh and clean clothing. And that was the first thing that he did, just as a good Samaritan. Later that night, quite late at night actually, as most of them were almost falling asleep, the door had a knock at it again. It was the same parishioner. And he said, "Pastor, the government authorities have learned that this group is somewhere here in the area, and they're looking for them. And if they find them, they will be sent back to North Korea." Pastor Vin realized what he had to do. He was one of the few who knew the way through the jungle over to the country of Cambodia, where these people would be safe. And so Pastor Vin died to his own interests and wishes, gave his wife a kiss goodbye. The children were already sleeping. And he got the 14 refugees and said, "Come on, we've got to go." And he led them through the jungle safely until they came to the Cambodian border and ultimately to the city of Phnom Penh, the capital of the country, where they registered successfully as refugees. Meanwhile, the Vietnamese authorities found out who it was that helped these people. And they came to Mrs. Vin, Pastor Vin's wife, and they said, "Your husband has committed a terrible crime against our state. And if he ever returns here, he will be immediately arrested and he will be sent to prison for life because of what he has done." Mrs. Vin communicated this to her husband in Phnom Penh by telephone, and Pastor Vin then decided, the only safe thing for me to do is to go to Thailand, where it's the safest country in the area. And so he kept trekking west instead of going east back home. He went to Thailand, and that's where I heard his story and met this pastor. Now that in itself is not a sad story. It's a wonderful, wonderful act of kindness on his part. But what I didn't know was that his wife, the next day after we met, she was going to have a major surgery operation. And she so wanted her husband to be there with her. And he so wanted to be with her too. And he was almost crying as he told me about, "Tomorrow my wife is going to go to the hospital and have this major surgery. And I so wish to be with her. But I can't, because if I go back, I'll be arrested and sent to prison for the rest of my life." And so my colleague and I prayed for him. And we asked God to give him wisdom, to be with his wife. And we prayed all the things that you would normally pray for a person in his situation. Months later, I heard from my colleague who introduced me to Pastor Vin that Mrs. Vin's surgery went well and was successful, and she was fine. Pastor Vin he felt like he was in Hades in Thailand. There was nothing he could do. All his passion and love were for people back in his country, including his own family, of course. And his spirits just plummeted to the depths. And he just couldn't take it any longer. And he decided, "I guess I don't care what happens to me. I just need to go home." And so he got on an airplane and he went back to Vietnam. And of course, as predicted, as soon as he got off the plane, he was immediately arrested. But then when he was taken to the authorities, they changed the punishment. And instead of sending him to prison for the rest of his life, he was given house arrest in his own home, indefinitely, which ended up being years. However, this meant that he was with his family every day, and he was accessible. And so new Christians who came to faith in Jesus would be brought to Pastor Vin's house, and he had all day to sit with them and share with them about the scriptures and about the gospel and about how Jesus expects us to be his hands and feet in the world today and how we live as a disciple of Jesus Christ. Pastor Vin became a great discipler of new believers. And for him, it was like a resurrection. He was so down in the pit. And yet now, he was doing the things that he loved to do and was being effective spiritually in every way and still being able to be with his family. You remember on an earlier video, I also shared about Corrie ten Boom, and one of her statements was, "No pit is so deep that Jesus cannot go deeper." And that was so true of Pastor Vin. And so the church in Vietnam continues to this day to grow exponentially. And it's an exciting story about how people there are coming to faith and putting their faith and trust in Jesus Christ. So, as I began this video, let me close with, Christ is risen. He is risen indeed.